All right. Thanks, Tobias. Hello, everyone. The first question is, can you hear me well back there, especially? Because my voice is a bit weak after the cold. I will try to, maybe speak to the microphone, but that doesn't always work. But I will try to do my best. So anyway, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining me today. My name is Roman Yakovlev, and I'm here to talk to you about some practical lessons that I have learned about successful open source collaboration between organizations. So I know I don't need to convince you that you need to collaborate, and you probably know open source already. So my goal for this talk is to give you some practical tools how you can collaborate, how you can collaborate successfully, and not on the level of one organization, but actually across organizations. So I won't be speaking too much about the philosophical part of open source, although I'm a big fan of it myself. So I will try to focus more on practical concerns here, like how do you build a working group that actually delivers results? So when do you need to formalize your governance, take it to the next level? How do you handle resource commitments across organizations, and so on. So that's what you can see now is a little bit of the structure of my talk. So I will start with setting the context about talking a little bit about open source and its nature. Then we'll spend a good chunk of time talking about Open Source Program Office, or OSPO, because it's kind of foundation for everything that you do inside the organization on open source. And then the heart of the presentation will be about collaboration mechanics. So how to form a working group, when to introduce this formal governance, what kind of legal agreements are essential. So that's the questions that we will answer. And then towards the end, we'll spend a bit of time talking about some common conflicts that might arise in collaboration and some answers how to solve them. And I will leave you with some concrete steps that you can take already now to start your open source journey. A couple of more words about myself. So I currently work as staff software engineer at GitHub. I focus on supply chain security software right now. Before that, I've been at GitHub a part of Open Source Program Office there, at GitHub for OSPO. And even before GitHub, I worked a little bit, I worked at Spotify on the media delivery platform of Spotify, and there we have faced some of the challenges, like ingesting the music from labels, and we had problems like matching words to artists and so on. So that's just to hopefully earn some credibility here. So I'm not totally alien to the field, so to say. So all right, basically let's move on and talk a little bit about the nature of open source. In fact, open source is the area that maybe without realizing you already know a lot of things about. Basically, it's because the open source is based on copyright. So I know that some people out there, not sure about the audience, but I know that some people have this idea that open source is like developers rebelling against intellectual rights, and but in fact, nothing can be further from the truth. The copyright is the foundation of open source. So developers, they still hold copyright in their works. It just they choose upfront to give away some of those rights if their recipients of the work follow the license terms. So, but again, I like this topic myself a lot, but I promise that we are going to do the practical things. So I'm not going to dive very deep into this, but still just want to kind of set the stage here so that the copyright is kind of still paramount open source. We'll now start talking about the Open Source Program Office and why is it an essential part of open source journey for an organization. You might think, okay, one more office, some more bureaucracy, but in fact, that might be a necessary step because, and not so alien to your organizations, because you already have teams that manage copyright compliance, that manage royalty distributions, international data exchange. So the OSPO takes all the same ideas, but transforms them to software, applies them to software, basically. So you can think about OSPO as the, if you use music terminology, about like a conductor for an orchestra, for your open source orchestra. So without a conductor, even professional, great, talented musicians, they cannot collaborate. They will produce noise. So they need a conductor. Also, like you cannot let musicians start and stop to play whenever they like. So they need to follow some frameworks. So that's the role of the OSPO. So it's not about controlling developers. It's not about introducing some red tape, but it's more about enabling them to move faster because they are confident that they're doing the right thing, that they are complying with all the legal obligations, that they follow the license terms, that they know where to go to ask about some legal questions. So when all of these bits are in place, developers basically can stop, hesitate, and start innovating. Particularly for copyright societies like yours, I think that OSPO can serve as a bridge between your legal expertise that you, I'm sure, have plenty of for copyright and your technical ambitions. So let's see actually what OSPO does. I think there are 5 the most kind of popular, most concrete steps that 5 pillars, if you wish, of OSPO work. Number 1 is the policy. So OSPO creates clear guidelines on how developers can contribute to open source, how they can use open source. Again, it's not about saying no, it's about saying yes, but with confidence. Second step is compliance. So just as you carefully manage copyright compliance for music, the OSPO basically ensures software copyright compliance. So this includes license auditing and making sure that all the license terms are met, all the obligations are executed. Third is security. So open source security is not just about vulnerabilities, although they of course play a big part of it, but it's also about just knowing what you use, having like a catalog of all your dependencies, and knowing what kind of vulnerabilities are there, and patching them in a timely manner. Next pillar is a community. Open source is all about relationship, and your OSPO can be this tool that you use to build this relationship with talking to maintainers, to other contributors, and in general to the broader open source ecosystem. These relationships are very important because they basically pay off dividends in the long run in terms of support and influence that you will get for this. Last but not least is the strategy. So the OSPO's goal is to align your open source usage policy with your business goals. So it basically helps you decide what to use, where to contribute, and how to use your limited resources in the most efficient way. Particularly for copyright societies, I think there are a couple of considerations that are especially important for OSPO to have in mind. You need to ensure the clear ownership for the code that you produce. So, just as you ensure that all the songwriters have the rights to contribute to a work before they can contribute. So you need to ensure that developers also have such right to contribute. This typically means that the employment agreements that you have need to have the open source contributions part covered. Then you need to carefully manage the integration between the proprietary systems and the open source, because sometimes certain open source components might require you to share the work that you own, and you might not want to do it for certain, proprietary, highly competitive parts of your stack. But at the same time, OSPO will still help to maintain the participation open source in the parts where that's okay to do these things. Also, you need to keep in mind that different organizations might have different level of maturity in terms of digitalization. And OSPO can help here to manage, contributions and consumptions in a way that works for everyone, like for more advanced societies and for those that are maybe just getting started. All right, to get some inspiration, I want to give you a couple of success stories of open source. The first one is Spotify, a company that of course you all know well. They manage quite a bit of open source components out there, over 200 I think, last time I checked. They have tools for music recommendation, for data pipelines. They have testing frameworks, open source. And there also helps them to basically share these innovations while still maintaining their competitive advantage. Another great example is, of course, Microsoft, which I think when the most dramatic change in terms of attitude towards open source. Back in days, they called it a cancer, basically, and were super anti-open source in Balmer days. But nowadays, they're in fact the biggest contributor, or one of the biggest contributors to open source. And they also help them on this journey, and now they see, I think, huge benefits in terms of developer recruitment and innovations and cost savings. Yet another example from big tech is, of course, Google. So they have a very massive presence in open source, over 2,000 projects just on GitHub. And for them, those also helped quite a lot by turning their open source participation from the cost center, basically, into a big and influential part of what Google does, influencing the industry standards and attracting top talent as well. And one more example that I think is very relevant to you is FINOS, or like FinTech Open Source Foundation, it's called. So it's basically a collaboration between financial organizations like banks that came together and decided to use open source in a way that still allows them to stay compliant, because they have very strict compliance rules, but still share the innovation and help each other. So I think that might be, the example might be quite relevant here. All right, so that was about OSPO. Now I want to talk about the main part, basically how practically can you start collaborating across organizations in open source fashion. And the first thing where we start is typically by forming a working group. So that's what we're talking about here. So not with grand plans, basically, but having some limited number of organizations, maybe at least 3, at most 5, I would say, that gather together and say, okay, we have this specific problem. How can we solve it together? So I would say, keeping it small in the beginning is very important, because the more members you get, the harder scheduling gets. So you need to get together to work together, and scheduling complexity grows exponentially with new members. So I would say keep it at 5 at most, and 3 is also a great number. The structure here could be quite simple. You can dedicate some time, like let's say 3 months for it, like a time box, and have some monthly calls between the enthusiastic people, between people who have real interest to participate, not with skeptics who will steal the momentum. You can have this rotating leadership, rotating chairs for these calls, like every month, different organization chair the call. And yeah, you run for some limited time, like 3 months. So in the first meeting, you basically set the stage by discussing what is this small, concrete, well-defined problem that all of your organizations are solving already. You will then audit the existing approaches. You will compare how you solve this problem now, and you will decide whether it makes sense to try and solve it together. So that should be really like honest assessment, because not all the problems are built for common work. So for a successful working group, I think there are some tools that you need to have in place, because with good tools, success is more guaranteed. The very important part is to have some shared space for communication, for real-time communications, especially like shared Slack channel, or maybe like Teams space or something like that. So like when you want to share some quick information, send some documentation, some links, and to have some informal communication builds relationships. Another thing you might want to have is email list to share some decisions there. So something that is archivable, something that is searchable. So when you decide something important, you send an email, and then that's how you keep the record of the decision. One more really helpful thing is shared calendar, so that you have, everybody sees the schedule, everybody knows when to join, so that people know when to come. more importantly, yet record your meetings. So have a video meetings and record them. Why? Because if it's all gets successful and new members will be joining, you will just give them recordings to watch. You won't need to spend time like catching up the new members, some meetings again, so they just can catch up on their own. Also good to keep the confirmation of the decisions that you've made. So for documentation, I would say it's important to document whatever happens in the working groups meetings. And here templates are your friends. So have a very simple template for the meeting where you just have a date, a list of participants, the names, the organizations, the agenda items that you have, bullet points, and the decisions that you made, and action items with the owner and the deadline of the action item. So that's basically sufficient. We need to write notes here. Additionally, I would suggest it's really useful to have a decision log as a separate document, maybe in a spreadsheet, where you have like date column, the decision column, the rationale column, and maybe some links to supporting documents. But that's really useful, especially like 6 months later, that you can easily refer people to these decisions that have been made, that are all gathered in the same place. And again, report meetings. It's super important, especially when there's disagreement about decisions and so on. So you have it on tape, basically. Now, working groups are great for exploration phase. But let's say you are successful with that phase and you're ready to move on. So eventually you will need some formal governance for your project. So some of the signals that you need to formalize can be the following. You have maybe 6 or more participants. Maybe you're handling the production code that's actually deployed to production in some of these organizations that participate. Maybe the money changed hands already. Maybe you need some legal agreements. So when at least 2 of these is true, you can think about starting the steering committee. So what it does is basically it has one representative from each organization, and these are people who have decision right. I think that's really important. So these people are not observers. They're not people who need to go back to headquarters for every decision. They have authority to make decisions themselves. Another thing to consider here is how long this runs. So typically I've seen it run for 1 year, but I would say 1 year is maximum. Maybe you can consider smaller terms, like 6 months, especially initially. This is important because this work is basically an extra work for the participants. So you want to prevent burnout because it might be quite a bit of extra work here, and additionally you want to balance the how do I say it? Basically, disregard that. I think that's the burnout is the most important thing that I want to mention here. Let's see. One more aspect here that I want to highlight is you need to make decisions in this in the committee, and that's typically made by voting. So you better decide the voting rules up front. So you need to figure out what kind of decisions need like unanimous voting, which needs just simple majority, and something in between. And then you need to also document the what kind of capabilities the steering committee has. Like, for example, can they approve the technical roadmap, or they can just suggest it, or can they allocate budgets or not? So this has clear boundaries. It helps to prevent conflicts. All right. Now some practical advice about operating the committee. Again, I would say the strict schedule is super important because you want people to actually show up there. So you need to pick the schedule, you need to have it on a shared calendar. People need to know when it happens, need to block the time, get into this mood of going there. you need to ideally, like with all good meetings, you need to have agenda ready up front, ideally maybe several days in advance, and all the pre-read materials need to also be available so that people can go to that meeting ready to make the decisions, not to figure out what this all is about, basically. Also, you need to have decision guidelines to be explicit. Like, if you have some technical decision to be made, it belongs to the technical committee, not to the steering committee. I will talk about technical committee a bit later. Like, if you need to allocate some budget, then you better know up front that it's a simple majority vote that's required to approve that budget. So having all this documented is super helpful. Yeah, so maybe like if you want to new members to join you, when you decide on new members, you might need unanimous voting to prevent any conflicts about membership. And if it's about production code, maybe the chair of the steering committee would need to have some special rights to make decisions unilaterally without any approval if something's really burning. Now about this technical committee. So I would say it's really important to have technical decisions being made separate from the business decisions. This is mainly to prevent situations where people who do not have the expertise about certain area to make decisions about those areas. Like when developers make decisions about business things and when business people make decisions about technical things. So the membership in technical committee ideally should be based on the achievement of people who go there. So it's not about seniority, it's not about title, but it's more about you need to have people there who actually write code, who review pull requests, who basically can demonstrate their technical leadership. And ideally, you should have this contained in terms of size, because 3 people is enough and 7 probably is the maximum, because more than 7 decisions made by committee are famously bad, so, and also hard to achieve, so don't go there. What it decides is basically the technical part. So separate from business, like what kind of programming language we will use for this project, what kind of architecture we use. Like when some organization likes, Python and the other likes Java. So yeah, this is the place where such decisions are made. So how the code review is done, what kind of security policies we are following in this project. So that's all the purview of the technical committee. All right, now everyone's favorite topic, legal agreements. Actually, they're probably simpler for you because your organization already deals with a lot of legal agreements and you have a lot of expertise here. But at the minimum, what you want to have is a thing called Contributor License Agreement, or CLA. So this is a document that an individual developer signs, which basically states and confirms that that the work is their original work, that they have right to contribute this work from their employer, the permission of their employer, and also it might include things like license, grant, the copyright, of course, still stays with the developer, but it might be explicitly containing the grant clause. It might contain the patent clause. Sometimes it's important. Some licenses require that as well. So that's kind of CLA is for individual developers. Between the organizations, you can have the thing called Memorandum of Understanding, which is also a document, which basically outlines the structure of your collaboration. So what exactly you're working on, how much resources you contribute to this, how you make decisions. So also important aspect, how you join, how you exit the collaboration, because exits also can be, successful exits need some special considerations sometimes. In terms of license, I think I would recommend, if I need to give one single recommendation for license, I would say go with Apache 2.0 license. I think it's one of the most popular licenses out there. I think the second most popular. It's also quite business friendly. It includes patent grants. The legal experts, they tend to quite like the Apache 2.0. It's easy to deal with. And if your work is successful, you might eventually need to have some separate legal entity to manage this collaboration. I'll speak about this a bit later as well. But so there are some rules, let's say, or guidelines when to create this separate legal entity. But I would say, as with everything, you better start small. Maybe don't start with legal entity right away, because it's might take a long time, and hesitation is a surefire way to kill the momentum. And that's, I think, the most important part for open source collaboration, the momentum. All right, so resource model. So it's basically about who contributes what, which organization contributes, how the different organizations contribute to the shared work. So there are several popular models out there. They all have some advantages, some drawbacks. The first model is the simplest, where all the organizations just contribute equally, like one full-time employee, for example, for the duration of the project. So it's quite fair if the organizations have similar size, but might get kind of unfair when the organizations are very different in size. And in that case, the model 2 might be better, like tiered model, when you introduce membership tiers and you say that the tier 1 gets to provide, let's say, 2 full-time employees. Large tier, the normal tier, medium tier is 1 full-time employee, and small tier maybe like part-time employee. So that's fair for organizations of different size, but then you need to negotiate all these tiers. So it might take some time to make decisions on that on those levels. And one model that I think is important and might work well in certain cases is project-based model. It's basically when one society contributes, let's say German society contributes this fuzzy matching algorithm, and Swedish society contributes royalty calculation to that algorithm system. And the advantage of this approach is that the ownership is very clear, and but the disadvantage is that you don't share the knowledge across organizations and don't share the expertise, which is one of the important parts of the open source collaboration. But again, you don't have to pick the right model, the ideal model, I would say, right away. So you can start with a simple model and let it run for some time and see if it's successful or not, and adjust on the fly. Now about the life cycle of collaboration. So I would separate it into 4 phases here. And phase 1 is where we are talking about this working group. It's an exploration phase. So it typically takes about 3 months, and you want to try and basically get the engagement going in this phase. The success criteria here becomes whether you continue meeting and you continue talking and continue doing something. Maybe building some proof of concepts, but maybe you don't need to measure the code output just yet. It's a bit early. So if you have, moved past this phase, if you are, eager to get things going for real, then you go to phase 2. Maybe it's for next 5-6 months after the phase 1. That's its duration. And there you might want to formalize the governance a bit, like introduce the steering committee. And you will probably deliver your first production code at this stage. And you maintain some, maybe 3 to 5 organizations that are committed to this. The success is measured here by the practical outcomes, like you have production code deployed out there. I would say the transition from phase 1 to phase 2 is the most difficult one here, because it might be hard to transition from talking to doing. The phase 3 basically is about growth. When you are successful, you scale your collaboration. It's maybe 6-9 months after phase 2. So you probably will establish some technical committees here, technical steering, technical governance, because your system will probably grow in complexity. You will probably expand to some more organizations from the initial 3 to 5. Maybe you'll run multiple projects simultaneously here. And success here is basically when you see that new organizations want to join. Because if somebody wants to join this effort, it means that they recognize the value that it brings. And the phase 4 is basically the maturity phase. After 1.5 to 2 years, basically. Here you can consider maybe building a legal entity already, because you might want to hold some shared assets like maybe trademarks or domain names. So you might consider hiring dedicated staff to work on this project. You might also consider the legal liability shielding, because nowadays, when this Cyber Resilience Act is introduced, the open source contributors and stewards, they get certain responsibilities, and that might be one of the reasons to have all this code, open source code, owned by a separate legal entity. Again, advice here would be to not rush through these phases. So let all the phase mature to its completion and move naturally. Don't jump directly to phase 4 when you're still exploring the collaboration opportunities. Right. That was kind of the framework that I wanted to introduce. Now I want to talk about some challenges that you will inevitably face when you go this path. There are different challenges, of course. The most simple ones, in a way, are technical challenges. So again, programming languages differs, preference might differ. Maybe some organization prefers like monoliths, and the other might prefer, microservices. So that's normal. That's all these disagreements are manageable. Then, of course, there is tension about resource allocation. So in open source world, there is quite famous or infamous, if you wish, tension between contributors and consumers. So when people who only consume and don't contribute, they come to contributors with some demands like fix this bug or add this feature, and feel entitled to this change. So that might happen as well, of course, across organizations. Then there is, of course, the challenge of maintenance. So after you move past the exciting phase of writing a new project, you move into a phase when you need to maintain it. Like you need to fix bugs, you need to answer user questions, you need to update dependencies, and so on. So sharing this burden fairly, I think it's one of the things that can help. So, as I said, fortunately, these challenges are manageable. And one thing that I want to really highlight again, although I mentioned it a couple of times before, is that clear documentation is super important, because document everything up front, basically. All the contribution processes, code standards, decision rights. When all this is known in advance, the conflicts decrease dramatically, actually. Another thing that's important is about transparent decision-making process. That's why you have this, all the records in public, all these steering committees, technical committees, they meet in public, they keep all their records and decisions in public, because if you see how the decision is being made, even if you disagree with it, you still tend to accept it. But the decisions that are made in private, if you disagree with them, it just breeds the resentment. No good. One more aspect is about rotating leadership. So you want to make sure that every organization get a chance to drive and a chance to follow. That helps us burnout, and also helps with avoiding situations where one organization takes over some domain and basically becomes the owner of it, which might not be feasible, or not feasible, but desirable also. And again, regular communication, like over-communicate, basically. Open source is predominantly asynchronous distributed work. You don't get to meet very often in person when you work in open source fashion. So in such a work mode, you tend to document everything, write as much as you can. Although, of course, yeah, video calls are great, common chat rooms are great, but basically the advice here is to over-communicate. That's a recipe for success. So I promised I will leave you with some concrete steps, the first step you can take to start this journey. And here they are, finally. So step number one is, I suggest you inventory your open source image. So I guarantee you already have, and maybe a lot of open source in your code base. But just get a clear list of it. If you're on GitHub, I can show you how to do it on GitHub, there is a way. If you know, there are some scanners, some tools, or you can just survey your developers and they will give you the list. Step two is identify some common pain points that can be solved collaboratively. So focus on something small, something contained, real, simple problem. Simple, but still, but still kind of painful, so that it's worth the efforts to invest and solve. The step three is to designate some person as your internal champion for this effort, to lead the OSPO, so to say. This doesn't have to be a huge investment upfront, especially. Even like one person working part-time on this can make a big difference here. So you need to give them clear mandate to represent all the open source activities of the organization. Step four is what we're doing here today. So reach out to your peer organizations, talk to each other, get inspired from each other, get excited, because that's basically, excitement is important for everything that we do, especially if you want to be successful. And one more step that I will talk about more on the next slide is actually about joining the existing communities. So you don't have to figure this out on your own. So many organizations out there went this path and they gathered their experience and they collaborate and share this knowledge. The first thing I would recommend is to join this community called To-Do group. So this is a community of practitioners from across different organizations that represent OSPOs, open source program offices at those organizations. They provide documentation like templates, guidelines that you can adopt more or less directly. They also, I think the most valuable thing about them is they have regular calls, I think monthly or bi-monthly, where they all gather and they basically welcome new participants, people who want to build OSPO. So your new designated OSPO champion can go to those meetings and introduce the problem space and what they try to do and get some real good, valuable advice there from practitioners. Additionally, for open source training, Linux Foundation has some good courses and certifications. This is where you learn about how you work in Microsoft, in open source as an engineer, as a developer, but also as a maybe project manager. They have separate courses for that part as well. Those courses are quite good, actually. I took some of them, I really recommend. Then there is Open Source Initiative. It's basically the organization that owns the list of open source licenses. Fun fact about OSI, Open Source Initiative, is that this is the organization that owns the trademark open source. So it's they who decide what can be or cannot be called open source, particularly the licenses. There's been some controversy around that recently, and just a fun fact here. So open source is a trademark. And again, I want to mention Finos here because I think they have really good examples of governance models that work for regulated industry. So they have it also documented, they have it in the open. I think some of the parts, some parts of that you might adopt. One thing to mention is the in the Source Commons organization, it helps build kind of this thing called inner source, which is like open source but within single organizations. So it's kind of to build this muscle memory of working in the open across teams maybe before you are ready to move to the open world. So, again, summary, 5 things to remember. Number 1, open source is actually copyright. You know it already, it's good. Second, create an OSPO. That's essential tool, helps you a lot. Start small, start with working groups, number 3. Number 4, evolve your governance at some reasonable pace, don't jump ahead. And 5, take small steps, but think big. So that's how you build the success. So that's basically it. I really thank you for being here and listening to this. I'm happy to answer some questions, but most importantly, I would say, I want you to talk to each other, not to me. I'm happy to help with some practical aspects, maybe putting you in touch with people that work in these different groups and so on. Maybe we'll talk about OSPO, I can talk about that. And I want you to live with this Chinese proverb that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time to plant a tree is now. So that's basically to say that open source community is ready to welcome you whenever you are ready. Thank you. Okay, some questions if you can.
All right, I can start. So yesterday I sent out a contract to our new developer, Mikael there, open to Stim Mikael. But that did not include the open source clause. So could you tell me what mistake I made?
I think the mistake would be that he will just own all the open source work that we do. So I think in Europe, okay, I will start with a disclaimer that I'm not a lawyer. But as far as I know, in Europe, all these contributions, they are not owned by employer by default. What you can do is you can create a contributor COA, basically. Sorry, I forgot the term again. This contributor agreement with him at a later stage, and there you will write all these things. Or you can write a separate extension to the contract at a later date. So talk to your lawyer.
Thank you. Any other questions? All right, so let's